to go to the archives for months at a time. They would pore over documents, take careful notes, often with those little tiny pencils on a sheet of paper provided by the archive. As we know, for most of us and for most archives, this is not how research works today. Today, the technology has really impacted the way that we do research. So instead of reading documents in the archive, we often will go to an archive, take photos of the sources we want, and then come home and read the documents at home or at the office over the course of a number of months and even years. So that workflow has really changed, and we needed some new tools to be able to manage that new workflow. There are at least two reasons for this change. One is, in many cases, a lack of funding or flexibility to be able to travel to archives for weeks and months at a time. Most of us just don't have the time to read in the archive anymore and spend that amount of time just really reading materials right there in place. And many researchers today have responsibilities and financial constraints that don't really have the luxury of spending a lot of time away from home necessarily. The second reason is really about technology. The technology has improved enormous amount in recent years. Photocopies and comprehensive notes are no longer the most efficient way to take sources home with us. So most of us now carry high quality digital cameras around in our pockets every day. And that's wonderful, and it comes with a lot of benefits. But that ability to take photos of all of these materials also comes with necessity to manage, organize, and review thousands of research photos. And that's also, there are benefits that come with that, but there are also challenges, and that's where Tropy comes in. So most of the session today will be about that second piece, that technological piece, as I show you actually the tool itself and how it works. But before we get into that, I'd like to just share a few kind of introductory thoughts and tips about the archival research process itself. And many of you, I'm sure, have your own tips and experiences, and I'm happy to talk more about those afterwards. But just to kind of think through how are we conceptualizing and framing this process of archival research, and what are some of the approaches that we take? And many of these come from other colleagues on the Tropy team, and we think a lot about how this process works. So first of all, we always encourage students and researchers to communicate with the archivist in advance if possible. So archivists, as you know, of course, they have expert knowledge about the collections you want to consult, and they can often point you to collections you didn't know about. So it's a very good idea to do that, especially now, even if you can't visit the archive in person. There's very often digitized material that you're not aware of or that hasn't been made public, or archivists just can point you in the direction of other collections, other materials that would be relevant for your research. So we really encourage that communication between researchers and archivists and librarians. And I think that's, at least at the institutions that I've worked at, often that's a gap that needs to be bridged. That seems like that may not be the case at EUI, but I think always encouraging that open communication is really, really helpful. Secondly, we really encourage researchers to read the finding aids beforehand of the collections they're going to consult, and start thinking about the organization of the archive itself. Finding aids are widely available online now for many organizations, not all, but I think trying to understand the shape of the collection and the logic of its organization when you're going into a particular collection or using an archive for the first time, it's really important to understand why it's organized as it is. Start understanding a little bit, just some small amount about the history of that collection, why it's there, and why it looks the way it does. And I think, as we start talking about metadata and the organization of information, it really does become important to kind of contextualize the documents you're using in a larger archival picture. So do as much homework as you can and research about the archive before you go. Along with that, we encourage folks to come up with a plan for how you're going to work, both when you're taking photos in the archive and afterwards when you're processing those photos, hopefully in Tropy. So we'll be talking about that more specifically. But I think the important thing to emphasize here is that it's really essential to have a consistent workflow that you follow reliably. It may seem like a lot of work, especially upfront, but it really is an upfront investment of your time that will pay off for many years. Setting up these systems will allow you to be able to find things more easily and just really streamline your process. So think about the system you're building as you take the actual photos in the archive. We encourage you to photograph the box itself, the folder itself, with any identifying information. And if there's a request slip or other documentation in the archive, take a photo of that also as reference. So it's really important to build in redundancies in this process, to build sort of multiple pathways to find the information about the documents in case you lose track. And I can say for many of us, and from personal experience, you will lose track, especially if you have hundreds and thousands of research photos. So really try to think before you start taking photos of things, think of how you'd like to do that and how you'll be able to find things if you lose the note or you lose sort of the metadata information later on. In terms of photo quality, we get this question a lot with Tropy, and our view from the Tropy team's perspective is that as long as your photos are legible, that's good enough. These photos will mostly be for you, unless you're building a digital collection or doing some other kind of public-facing project, and which of course would involve permissions and all sorts of other details. These research photos are really for you. For most people, the camera on your smartphone is plenty. Obviously, that's your decision how you want to manage with sort of file management and the amount of space and storage you have on your device. But there's really no need to buy a digital SLR or bring a very fancy camera into the archive unless you have a particular need for high quality images. So I think that there's can be some anxiety about that sometimes, that your photo quality has to be really, really excellent. Basically, our view is, it needs to work for your purposes. And for many of us, that's just, it needs to work for us to be able to read the images and transcribe them. So legible is good enough from our point of view. How in the current situation that we're in, how can we go about finding digitized sources right now, digital collections and materials? One of the things that we suggest is to sort of start with certain content aggregator sites. And of course, there'll be many, many resources like this through your library. But just a couple of examples of where to start is the Europeana content aggregator. For American history, we look at the Digital Public Library of American history collections. There's a lot more available in digital form than there was even just a few years ago. And I think even during the last year, during COVID, many more materials have been put online. So that's something to think about. It's a challenging moment, obviously, for many reasons, and archival research is difficult right now, but don't count out what you can find in digital collections. And I've also found that I come across a lot of digital collections in my field, which is Latin American history, on Twitter, actually, through Twitter historians, hashtag, and a lot of sort of the historian conversations that happen on Twitter and Latin American studies as well. There are a lot of scholars sharing links to digital collections that are going up all the time. So I would encourage you to kind of explore that online space for research as well. Okay, with all of that said, once you have these archival research photos, what's the next step? What should you do with these photos? How will you process them? For smaller projects, you might have been able to, in the past, just use your excellent memory or a few Post-it notes, jot down the essential metadata. But as you move into dissertation research or research for a potential book project, two things start to change about your sources and your research process. The first is the volume of sources. So this is a problem that's often referred to by scholars as a problem of archival bulk. You'll have sources from many different collections, many different archives. You'll look at many sources from one archive in many cases. And it's at some point, just the volume and the bulk makes it impossible to keep track of sources and to remember what you've looked at and what you haven't without some kind of help. The second thing that really changes when you get into dissertation research is the amount of time between the moment when you look at a source for the first time and when you eventually write about it. And that will depend, of course, on different timelines, depending on your program and your situation. But often that's a very long period. It can be many, many months between finding a source and writing about it, and even years can pass, especially if you're working on a longer term book project. So you can't rely on your own memory. You won't be able to remember what materials you have, where you filed them, how you labeled them. And this is where we get back to consistency. I think we've all been in a situation where we're staring at a folder of endless image files with all sort of numbered codes on them. And the process of identifying those images, let alone reading them or making meaning out of them, feels a bit daunting. So what you'll need is one unified system to describe your photos so that you know what and where they actually are. And then also a way to organize them, to label them, but to also sort of fit them flexibly into some kind of structure that you'll be able to adapt as your project evolves and develops. So most of us starting out a research project, we don't know necessarily what the chapter structure will be. We may have an idea, but would like to change it later on. That's one of the advantages of Tropy, is the flexibility. So we're looking for kind of a balance between structure and flexibility. For the remainder of the webinar, I'll be showing you what Tropy can do in more detail to really help meet these challenges and answer some of these questions that I've laid out. And my goal here is to familiarize you with Tropy's main features and give you an idea of, if you were to download Tropy today and just try to get started, what would you have to know? How could you just get into it and start using it in a way that will be useful for you? So my plan is to first show you a fully developed Tropy project to give you a sense of what that looks like. And from there, we're going to start over and build our own project from scratch together so you can see how we get to the more developed look. I think it's important to have both. Starting with a blank slate can be intimidating. So it's helpful to see what a developed project already looks like. But at the same time, we need to know how to get started, because all of us will eventually be starting with a blank project on our own computers with our own project. So I'm going to share my screen so you can see my Tropy window. Okay, and you should be able to see that. Great. To see everything in the screen share, it depends on your Zoom settings, but I've had participants say before they had trouble seeing it. So you may need to go to view options at the top and change your option to fit to window. But if you're able to see it, then no worries, you don't need to bother with that. Okay, before we get started and dive into this, a few quick facts about Tropy, important facts. Tropy is free. Tropy is easily downloadable at tropy.org, tropy.org. You can download it for Mac, Windows, or Linux. It is open source software, and it's desktop software. So that means Tropy does not live in the cloud. You do not need an internet connection to use it. Once you download it to your computer, you're ready to go. And that's, I think, really important. I've worked in many archives where there wasn't necessarily Wi-Fi available. If your internet connection is unreliable for whatever reason, or you're on the road or traveling, you can still use Tropy. So it lives on your desktop. It lives on your own machine, your local machine. We do not track users with Tropy. So we're obviously, we're a nonprofit organization. This is a grant-funded project. We really have an educational mission. So it's really important at the center for our products to be free and open source, accessible to all. And we try to provide as many resources as possible for folks to actually learn how to use the softwares. But we don't collect data on our users or anything like that. So all of that is just important to know as we get into using the software itself. Everything I'm going to talk about today is in our documentation, what you might think of as the Tropy user manual, and you can find that at docs.tropy.org. I'd highly recommend reading over that documentation before you start working in Tropy. And once we're done today, you'll really have the basics. You'll have kind of the basic level of the documentation, but there's of course always more to learn. So when you hit a problem, I'd recommend going there first for help. And we work hard to really make things as easily understandable as possible, and really explain how to use the software as easily as possible. So recommend checking that out. So a quick tour of what we're looking at here in Tropy. What we're seeing right now in this center section is the item table. So this is going to contain by default all the items in your entire project. You can view the item table in the grid form like this, where you can see the thumbnails, or in a list form. And sometimes this can be easier as you're kind of organizing materials and you want to see the metadata and track different information up close. But this allows you to kind of zoom in if you'd like to see the thumbnail, again, sort of visually flexible. On the left-hand side here, we see some lists. So lists are ways that Tropy allows you to organize items and materials according to your own project structure or according to themes. Okay, so as I mentioned, we might have a chapter structure. Here's chapter 1 and chapter 2 of this particular project. Or you might have a theme such as conspiracies. My colleague, Abby Mullen, created this theme for her own work. But you can create thematic lists. You can really create lists for any topic that you'd like to. So you can create as many lists as you want and put items into as many lists as you want. And the great thing about the lists is if you delete a list, you're not deleting any of the items within it. So the items in your Tropy project will always be here in this main item table. No matter how you organize them or choose to reorganize them, all of them will be here in this general area. So you can't lose your items within Tropy. Below the lists here, we have tags. You can create as many tags as you want, tag as many items as you want. And there's no limit to the number of tags an item can have. So as you can see, we have tags here for different important historical actors, themes, locations, and we're going to talk more about each of these features as we go through it, but I want to give you a quick tour of sort of what we're looking at. On the right side, we have the metadata pane. So obviously this is very important where you'll fill in the metadata about your items and the information about the archive, other essential information that you need. Below this is the photos pane. So this gives you information about the actual image file within the item that you've imported into Tropy. This can be important, to make sure that your images are displaying correctly. Remember where you save the images themselves. But for the most part, when we talk about metadata, we'll be working up here in the metadata pane. The notes pane below will show particular notes that you've taken on this particular item. So that could be your own notes to self as you read through it. That could be transcription. Many people use the notes field to transcribe items or to translate them if they're in a different language that you'll need to eventually translate. So this is kind of a tour of this main view, but I think we need to dive in a little further now because where do we actually take these notes? So how does this information actually get entered? To show this, I'm going to double click on the item in the item table to move us from item view where we are now, or rather project view where we are now, to item view. And this is where you're going to view your item in more detail and do a little bit more work on your individual item. So let me just see. And true to form, the photo is not showing up in the important moment. Just one moment here, let me find this. There we go. Okay. Troubleshooting technology issues on the fly. This is a skill that we all have learned at the center. Okay, so the photo is now appearing, so that's important. And what I just did, and this is something, if you ever had issues, this is something that we can always troubleshoot in the forum or in the documentation, but essentially what I was doing there was just making sure that Tropy was talking to the right image file. So when you bring your photos into Tropy, as we'll see in a few minutes, Tropy is actually just, it's not editing any of your photos. It's essentially just creating a link between Tropy and the image file itself. And if a project gets moved around on your computer, that link could be temporarily broken or ruptured. So you'll often have to tell Tropy where to find the image, and Tropy can kind of figure that out once you let it know. So since I'm using these sample projects, occasionally things get scrambled, but here we are in the photo view. Okay. So you'll see on the top here, just to give you a tour of what we're looking at, there's a photo editing toolbar. So this will often help you see your photo better. We have some advanced photo editing tools here. You can adjust brightness, contrast, hue, saturation. You can sharpen the photo. And for microfilm, I find this pretty helpful. You can invert colors. So that can be really useful if you're using an inverted microfilm. Obviously, revert to original here is always an option. Now, before anyone gets nervous, I always want people to know that what I'm doing here is not changing the image file itself. So I'm just doing photo editing that helps me to read the photo better in Tropy. But Tropy will never change your image files. If you'd like to change the image, you can make changes here and export the image as a new image file. But I think it's really important for everyone to know that the image files will remain, and Tropy doesn't actually change them. So even if you make a mistake in Tropy or something like that, it's never going to threaten the actual photos that you've taken in the archive. Okay, so we have the photo editing tools up here. You can see obviously zoom is an important one for reading different types of photos. This button here fits it to the page, so that if you're zooming around and you want to come back to the page, that's an important option to have. We can rotate. Obviously, this can be very important if your photos are taken from a different angle, depending on the shape of the original page. Add notes here. So this is the notes field, and you can transcribe or take notes. And again, Tropy's customizability is really, I think, very useful. So this gives you some different options in how you want your notes to be viewed. I don't know that I want mine to be viewed this way, but depending on the document that you're looking at, you can have a vertical writing mode. You can change the layout. So here I'm taking notes side by side with the document. I can also stack and take notes down below with the document. So these are just things for you to think about what process works best for you, and for your own ease of use. How do you want Tropy to be set up? Okay, so I've given you kind of the main layout of what Tropy looks like with this larger project, and you can see how all the fields are populated. Now, I think we're going to dive into creating a new Tropy project, and that will allow us to see, what happens when you start from scratch. Okay, so I go to File, New Project, creating a new project. And when we create a project, we really encourage you to think expansively when you're naming your project. So you might create one Tropy project for your entire dissertation, for example, or for your book project. I'm going to name this one for my book project. Tropy really has the ability to manage a very large research project within one Tropy project here. So we'd encourage you to kind of think expansively about the whole project. And then from there, you can create chapters, subsections, and kind of organize within the larger umbrella. So now we have our blank slate, and we're going to import some photos into our new Tropy project. So I have some photos here that I'm just going to take the image files and drag and drop them right into Tropy. You can drop them right into the item table here, and you'll see Tropy immediately starts importing the items. What types of files can Tropy import? Tropy can import nearly any type of image file, including JPEG, JPEG 2000, PNG, hike, SVG, TIFF, and PDF. And that's actually a relatively recent addition, one of the latest releases of Tropy, that Tropy can now do PDFs, which I think is really, really useful and very important. I said this before, but just important to note again, Tropy does not make a copy of your photos. Instead, Tropy is linking to the existing photo wherever it exists on your hard drive. So nothing you do in Tropy will affect your original image files. Even deleting them out of Tropy, or even, heaven forbid, destroying your entire Tropy installation will have no effect on your original photos. So I think everyone can sort of rest easy and breathe a sigh of relief about that. I know there can be some anxiety about messing up your research photos, and that's something you don't have to worry about in Tropy. Okay, so we've brought our photos into Tropy. We want to do some work immediately with them without even looking at them individually to ensure that we know where these photos came from. And so this is where it's a really important part of your process to do this as soon as possible so that you don't lose track of which archive these photos are from and what the important metadata is. Aside from being the right thing to do for citation purposes, obviously, recording the path by which you got these materials will be really helpful if you ever need to go back to that archive, if you ever need to ask a question of the archivist, or even ask someone else to go back for you. If you have a colleague who's going to do a trip to the archive or a research assistant or student, you really want to set it up so that you could easily duplicate how you found these materials. So record the metadata as soon as possible, the same day if possible. And if you've downloaded materials from a digital collection, we really encourage you to record this information before you close the browser window, because I think we've all been in a situation where, oh, I can't find that website again. I don't know how to get back to that page. So really encourage you to do this as soon as possible. Here, I'm going to click on last import here on the left. In our case, this is our only import because we just started this project, but I want to just show you that feature. If you have hundreds of photos in Tropy, it can be very helpful to click on last import to find what you last brought in. So that's kind of an important part of the workflow. Here I can see the photos I just imported without having to comb through any other photos that are already in Tropy. Tropy allows us to do some bulk editing that can be really, really useful and allows us to kind of label a number of materials and a number of photos all at once without having to go in individually. So what I've done here is I've selected all these photos and I'm going to go over to the metadata pane here and fill in the bulk metadata for this archive and collection. So in this case, these photos are from the National Archives and Records Administration in the US. The collection is the central decimal files. And in this case, I can put the box number, which is 3835. And all of these were from folder 11. Okay. By just doing that, I now know where all these photos came from. So if these get separated or anything else happens, even without going into them individually, I've now labeled each of them with this important metadata. This will save you a lot of time because you're adding metadata in batches and of many photos at once instead of going in one by one. We encourage you to always include as much detail as possible. That will help you later on. And I try to set up systems with my research photos that could be used by a complete stranger or a third party. This is a really great recommendation I had once from a professor in graduate school, but it's important to realize, even though these are internal systems, that very likely you may be the only user of your Tropy or of your research photos, it's important to set it up so that another person could use it. So avoid shorthand, avoid abbreviations, because very often you'll find a few months later, you won't remember what your shorthand was. And also, we'd really like to leave the door open for the possibility of collaborative projects in the future. And I can talk more about that. Tropy does have some collaborative mechanisms now for multiple people to work on a project. So as much detail as possible and as little shorthand as possible. Create it so that someone else could use it and understand it. Now you'll notice here the rights field has this little alert and this little triangle next to it. That is flagged because we want you to fill the rights field in for every single item. It's really important that you know your rights for reuse, publication, and holding of this material. And this is obviously ethical practice as a researcher and a scholar. It's also going to save you a lot of time and headache later on if you're working with a publisher. So this is something that we've built into Tropy, where we really try to remind you to always fill out this section. And there's more information about that rights and reuse in the documentation. So here, I know that these materials are in the public domain, so I'm going to fill that in here. You might also include in this field, for example, a link or to a URL to the archive's rights policy on their website, if that's online. If you signed a document about rights and usage when you visited the archive, it's a good idea to take a photo of that and keep that documentation and also bring that into your Tropy project so that you can refer back to it. So these are just important, documentation practices that will be really helpful, especially when you go to publish. Okay, I have this metadata template here. We filled in some metadata. But what happens if the metadata that I want to record does not fit into this template? What if I need to include, for example, another field? In the case of the National Archives in the US, many of these materials will have a record group, for example. But here, we don't have the option to fill in a record group. Okay, this brings us to, I think, one of Tropy's most powerful features, which is its customizable metadata templates. So I'll start by saying, by no means do you have to customize your metadata templates. We've created the Tropy generic template for you, as well as Tropy also comes with a Tropy correspondence template. So if you're working with letters, the Tropy correspondence template is a great form for you to use to fill in the author, the recipient of the letter, location, and some of the other information. I'm using the Tropy generic template here, and you can see I have a number of other templates. But I'm going to show you now, in the occasion that you would like to customize your metadata template and you have reason to do so because of the collection you're working with, you would go to Preferences here and Templates, okay? So this is really in the case where the information you want to record about your items doesn't fit into a standard template. You can make a template of your own. And you can actually make as many of these as you'd like. So to do that in here, what we're in right now is what's called the template editor. So what I'm going to do is first start with Tropy generic, which is the just general Tropy metadata template that Tropy comes with. I know many people who only use a Tropy generic template, and that works perfectly for them, and that's absolutely fine. So I encourage you to start with that. But if you do want to do some more customization, you would start with Tropy generic here, and then you can see here, these fields are all grayed out. So I'm not able to change Tropy generic. That's already locked and that's set by us. But what I can do is make a copy. So I'll click this little icon here. And now I've made a copy of Tropy generic. This allows me to start with the Tropy generic template, but change it and add and subtract and edit the fields that I'd like to. So what I'm going to do here is just create a template for the National Archives. I can fill in the name for the template here. Tropy will automatically generate this URI, which is unique to your new template. So you don't need to do anything with that. That's done automatically. And then what I can do is I can scroll down here. Well, I'm going to create the template. And then I scroll down and I see these are all the fields. So you can see the title, creator, date, type. These are all the fields that we saw over here in the metadata pane. Let's say I want to create a new field for record group, for example. So here we'll use the identifier property, and there's a lot to learn about metadata if you're interested in learning about the Dublin Core and other sort of metadata standards and principles. That's a really interesting field, so I encourage you to learn more. It's by no means required in order to use Tropy, but an interesting rabbit hole to go down. So I'm going to change this identifier field to record group because I really want to fill in a record group for all of my National Archives materials. Okay, so just as an example, I'm labeling this as a record group. There are some other things here that you can do with templates depending on what your interest is. So let's say I'm only getting materials from record group number 25. I could fill in 25 here as the default value, meaning that whenever I use this template, record group 25 will always come in automatically. So I don't ever have to fill in that field, okay? Here, for example, I can fill in a hint. So in this case, it's just a note to myself, but can say fill in the record group here, but you could create a hint for, you know, whatever would be helpful for you to remind you how to use that field. If you want to make it a mandatory field, you can check this box, and that's similar to what we did with the rights field, what I showed you earlier. So that means that you would have to fill that in every single time, okay? So we're going to close out of the preferences. You don't need to save this. It auto saves in the template editor, okay? So I'm going to close out of preferences here. And here in this Tropy item that we've worked on, I'm going to click on my National Archives template that I just created. Okay, you can see that it's mostly the same, but what field has changed? This is now called record group, and it's filled in with 25. So that was the default value. That means anytime I choose this template, it'll say record group 25. If I make that mandatory, it'll have that the little flag next to it. So this is just to give you an idea of sort of what we can do with the customizable metadata templates. And think about sort of different metadata schema that would work best for your materials, okay? Okay, now just give me 1 second. So we're now going to go in and focus on one particular image. And we're going to try out a few of Tropy's features. So going back to project view here, the first feature, and I think one of the most powerful when you're working with a large quantity of images, this is called the merge function. So what I can see here is these first 6 photos here. This is a multi-page document. It's 6 different image files, but it's one document that I found in the archive. So I would like to save these photos as one item, not just as 6 separate photos. To do this, I'll select those 6 photos, right click and select merge selected items. And you can see those 6 photos have now been zipped up into one single item. The photos are still there. They're all 6 pages are there. And I can see here in the lower right with the photos, there are 6 image files contained within there, but this has now become one item. And that allows me to create metadata for that one item and have multiple pages within it. And I think that's really powerful, especially for those of us who are working with very, very long documents in the archive. It can be unwieldy and pages can get out of order if you don't have the right system. So creating this item is really, really useful. Another sort of batch editing tool that you can use that's very helpful is the rotate tool. And you can rotate multiple photos at once. So as you can see here, these remaining photos are all rotated to the left, which makes it difficult to read them. I'm selecting those photos. I'm going to right click and I'm going to select rotate right. And all at once they rotate right. So they're just in one click, they're right side up and I can begin to read them. So when, you know, we're only working with 12 items here, but you can imagine if you have hundreds or thousands of items, it makes it a lot easier and a lot faster to get them into the shape that you need them in to use them. So we're going to zoom in from here into item view. I double click on this multi-page item that I've created. And as we saw in the other project, we have Tropy's tools here to improve the legibility of the photos within Tropy. Again, does not change the original photos. It's only making the changes within Tropy. So we can rotate. Again, zoom to different levels. We can fit the item to the page. And then we can, again, over here, change in the advanced photo editing tools, change brightness, contrast, and the like. So that's really helpful. We, again, have the notes field down here, transcription, or we can move that over to the side. Now that I've zoomed in on this item, I have an idea of what it's actually about, okay? So I can fill in the item level metadata that we did not yet fill in when we were doing the bulk edit of metadata. So here we'll fill in the title here, which is the report on the program for Colombian students. The author is Otis Green. And it's important to say it's really up to you as the researcher how you want to create these systems and fill in information for something like an author name or a creator name. I always start with last name first, and I think that's good practice. But depending on your research, depending on your needs, and even the language that you're working in, you can create systems that work best for you. So this is how I would list a creator. We go into date, and this is where we do encourage you to always use ISO format. So you'll see the hint is here. Start with the year, then the month, and then the day, separated by dashes. So you'll see here, if I fill in the date, January 26, 1942, it's in correct ISO format, Tropy will reformat that for me. And you can customize this in preferences, how exactly you'd like the date to appear. But it's important to use ISO format so that Tropy can read the date and really compare it to other materials as you go through. And you'll see here, we already filled in all this other metadata. So for now, we have everything filled out, and this document is pretty well labeled. Another very helpful feature of Tropy is the selection feature. So this allows you to pull out a small piece of your item or your photo to take notes on, or even change the metadata of that particular piece. So this can be particularly useful for newspapers if you have a very large broadsheet or a large newspaper page, but you want to focus in on one tiny announcement or one tiny article. You can easily select that. And I'll just show you here kind of what that looks like. We take the selection function and can just drag, create a little box here if we wanted to, for some reason, select the name of Otis Green chairman. And you'll see the selection appears down here under the photo, so that, and we can sort of zoom in there. So that automatically generates, and if it can be really helpful as you're reading through things, if you want to highlight something, come back to it later, creating a selection is a really useful way to do that. The other very helpful function of Tropy that is also very flexible is the tag function. And we saw this when we were in project view earlier. So Tropy allows you to create customized tags to organize your material. And you'll see here, I've clicked next to the metadata pane, we have the tag pane here. So you can add a tag to your item. And in this case, we don't have any tags yet, so we're creating tags. So I can create as many tags as I want. Here I'll use, for example, Colombia, thinking about location and which country this is most related to. I might create a tag for Otis Green, a particular person, a historical actor in my research. And you'll notice that the Tropy, the default that I have this set to is that Tropy will just create a random tag color when you create a tag. You can also go in and change those. So if I right click here, I can change the tag color. I can create my own color-coded system. And I can also have a default tag color. Say I want all the tags to be orange. We encourage you to use different colors because that helps visually to distinguish things. But using the colors can really help you to quickly identify the tags. The other type of tagging that we recommend, and I've found this very powerful in my own research, is to create tags that have to do with your research process, kind of the logistics of what you're doing in Tropy and your workflow. So for example, I create a tag called transcribed. I often use green, so it's great that it just randomly assigned it green, but I think that that's a great color to use. We've had users talk about using traffic light colors based on sort of red, yellow, and green based on sort of where they are in the process of transcription or processing. But this is the kind of tag that will allow you to very quickly identify what you've already worked on, what you've completed, and where you are in your process. And I think that can be really, really powerful. Okay, so when we go back to the project view here, you'll notice the tags are now here in the left-hand column, and this item has those color tags on it. So that can really help visually for you to see where you are with your research. I'm also able to assign tags from the project view. So if I know, for example, I already transcribed this item, I can just drag it to transcribed, and now it has the green dot on it. This allows me to come into my project and quickly see what's transcribed, what isn't, where am I, and it can really help visually to kind of lay things out in that way. Okay, Also in this pane, we're able to create new tags. So say you're not in the item anymore, but you've zoomed out into the larger picture. And say you want to think about translation for some of these documents. I can create a translated tag here and assign it, for example, gray. And I can start assigning tags from the project view as well. Okay, so that will pop up and that will be easy to see. So tags are flexible and they work in either project view or item view. The other really important feature that we use quite a bit are the lists. And that's another feature for organization and structuring your project. So I've just gone to File, New List. I can create a list here for Chapter 1. I can drag my items into Chapter 1. But you'll see that item is now in Chapter 1, but it also remains in the main project item table. So no matter where you file your items and where you organize them or tag them, they will always remain here in the item table. And that's really a good place to come back to home if you're not able to find something or if something seems amiss. You can drag items into as many lists as you want. And as I said, beyond just the structure of your book, chapters, subsections, etc., you might also create other types of lists. So here we might have an education list. Say all the materials that are about education will go into that list. We don't know if they'll be in Chapter 1, 2, or 3, but we know that the theme of education has these materials associated with it. So again, we want to encourage you to think about sort of the architecture, the information architecture of your work. Even if you don't know the architecture of the book yet or the dissertation, start thinking about how will I structure this? How do things fit together? And the other important point about these lists is that if you delete a list, it will never delete the items. So again, these are just sort of buckets that you've created, structures that you've made within Tropy, but all of the items remain up here. So lists are non-destructive and tags are non-destructive. If I delete a list or a tag, it's gone, but the items remain there. So that's really an important thing to keep in mind. The other feature that can be really useful is just search. So if I put in green, Otis Green's report will pop up. The search will search all text in all the metadata for all your items, and it will also search all the notes. So this is really, really powerful if you're transcribing information and then you want to do just a full text search to find certain terms or find a name. You can use the search there, and that's going to be really, really useful. A few words about backup and export, and these are questions that we get a lot. The first thing I'll say is that in general, when you're working in Tropy, we encourage you to just really work in Tropy, stay in Tropy, and continue to do your work in Tropy. In many cases, it's really not necessary for you to export, although we do have some options for export, and I can give you a quick sort of rundown of those. But you would back up your Tropy project file just as you back up any other file. So I can keep this in a Dropbox folder, for example, on an external hard drive, on my local drive. Just think about backing up Tropy the way you back up everything else. The important thing is that you'll need to keep Tropy as well as the photos that you've linked Tropy to. So very often what we would have is the Tropy project file and then a folder with the research photos. And those can be structured however you'd like to structure them. But the important thing is that Tropy knows where to find your photos. And if it loses the link, that you can kind of find the link again, as I did earlier, and direct Tropy back to it. So all of that, obviously, we encourage you to back up, as would be standard practice. You can share your project with others and even work on a Tropy project collaboratively. But at this point, you're only able to do that asynchronously, meaning I can, for example, with my colleague, Abby Mullen, I can have my Tropy project in a Dropbox folder that we share. And we actually have that for some of our training materials. But if I'm working on the Tropy project right now with all of you, Abby is not able to work on it on her computer. So I would have to close out the project and then she could begin working on it. So we're not quite doing synchronous collaboration yet, but we found that most researchers don't need synchronous collaboration, that it's more, you know, one's working during one time and one's working at another time. If you'd like to connect any of your Tropy materials to a more public-facing sort of exhibit project or something along those lines, you can install our Omeka plugin to export Tropy materials to Omeka. Omeka is also a free open source software that was developed at the center as well. So we have a close relationship with Omeka, and you can export to Omeka directly. You can also export to a CSV file using our CSV Export plugin. And for some folks, that's particularly useful. They like to have their metadata in a CSV for different reasons. But I'll reiterate again, for the most part, you can really just get into the habit of working on your materials in Tropy. And if you have them on your computer, you know, Tropy isn't going anywhere. Tropy's going to be around, and the software is quite stable. So you can really work in Tropy and continue to work in Tropy. And there shouldn't be too much of a need to take materials out of Tropy. But however, you always have the option to do so should you need to. You can also print out full copies of your items, and I found this is useful particularly for teaching, for example. So you can print to an actual printer if you want to print it onto paper, or you can print to PDF. And that it didn't let me do that just then. But essentially, I could show you this, and this is in our documentation as well. But essentially, it would just sort of create a 1-page or 2-page document with the item, the image, but also with all the metadata there. So if I want to share a primary source with my class, for example, I can create a PDF from Tropy that just brings all the metadata and the image itself right out there, and it kind of presents it in a way that's very easy to understand. Within the preferences, you can actually change the layout for those printouts. So as I said, it's worth, you know, taking time to set up these systems in advance. It will pay back a lot of dividends later on. I have a few links here that I just like to put into the chat. Just give me 1 second. And I hope that these will be useful for all of you to kind of learn more about Tropy and keep in touch with Tropy. There we go. Okay, I'm going to pause my screen share for a moment and just put these links in the chat. So these are links to the documentation, docs.tropy.org, the forum.tropy.org, and that's where you would go for more complicated questions that maybe are not covered in the documentation, or that if we're not able to cover them here today. And I'd encourage you to find us on Twitter. We do a lot on Twitter, talking to users, answering questions, sharing about new releases of Tropy, sort of what's new, what the updates are, as well as to sign up for our newsletter. And there's that link there for the newsletter. So we really, as I said, we don't collect information on users, we don't collect data, but we are interested in staying in touch if you'd like to. And we always have new releases and new features coming out. So we're very happy to share that with users, and we encourage you to let us know how Tropy's going for you. Send us screenshots. We can try to help troubleshoot stuff. In general, our developers are excellent and they're very, very responsive. So if you post a question in the forums, you'll have an answer very often within 24 hours. And that's a really important part of our project too, is that we want to be in constant interface with our users. Many of the changes that we've made in new updates of Tropy have really come from user comments. So we're very open to that, and we're very interested in how folks are using Tropy and what we could do to improve it. So I think I'll leave it there for the main presentation, and we can open up to questions, and I'm happy to dive in. I have a lot of questions. Okay, great. So we have a half hour if you are not too tired, but it's the morning. So, but I will start with a question which is transversal to many of the people who attended. It's the compatibility between
Tropy and on the software, management software like Mendeley, Zotero. How is it possible to work with interactively with the software? That's a first transversal question. Then but Sean also answered already in the chat to some questions, but I prefer to repeat it before the other to see the answer. Emily was asking about the size of a Tropy project. Are there limits? And of course, Sean said, no, there is no limit of a project. You can you confirm this? Yeah, okay.
Correct. Mm-hmm.
Then Francesca asked two things. And this is linked to what you said at the end about backup and also the fact that you have the possibility to keep your materials and the photos in a cloud somewhere. She has, Francesca, better saving the photo on a cloud to keep the links functioning when changing computer. This is, I think, an important issue to deal with. I'll leave you the floor to answer, then I go to another question.
Absolutely. So I mean, it's really up to you and it's a matter of preference. I use Dropbox very often, and that's what I use collaboratively. And so that's what I'm using today. And as you saw, it's pretty easy to relink the photos if they're not, if the link gets broken for some reason, which it shouldn't. But yeah, I think if you're changing devices, changing computers, saving them in the cloud is a great idea. And it's very easy to like relink, or what we call consolidate your photo library in Tropy. So that will sort of relink Tropy to all of your image files. So I would say absolutely saving in the cloud is a great idea. I wouldn't say it's necessarily better. I think it's just a matter of preference. And we have detailed instructions on what to do, even if you didn't save them in the cloud. If you change to a new computer, it's quite easy to kind of set up those links again. But I think if you're used to using the cloud for your file management, I would definitely encourage you to do that with Tropy as well.
Then export import from Zotero from Mendeley to Tropy, is it possible?
So the easiest way to do this, I think, is through the CSV export. So the CSV export from Tropy really, again, allows you maximum flexibility, and that you can pull anything into a CSV, and then if you want to pull it into another software, it's fairly straightforward. I believe, and Sean would know more to answer the question about integration with Zotero. In general, for my own use, and I think for many people, we use Zotero more for secondary sources and Tropy more for primary sources. That doesn't always have to be the case, but I think for many of us, that's how we kind of organize these different softwares and kind of use them to their best, for their best use and kind of for their own purposes. At the same time, many of the developers who developed Zotero have been in very close conversation with the Tropy developers, and we've had many of the same folks working on those projects, including Sean. So Sean may have more to say about that. But I would say in terms of integrating with other types of softwares, the best way to do that is through the CSV export.
Okay. A question about vocabularies from Neil. She asked whether in vocabularies, in preferences, you can import other standard vocabularies or list of metadata standard that you could import into Tropy. Is it possible?
Yes, it is absolutely possible. And actually, Tropy ships with many other metadata vocabulary standards already in there. So when you go into preferences and into where I clicked on templates there in Tropy, we can actually click on vocabularies and explore all the vocabularies that are available there. So I think you'll find anything that you've worked with or that you're looking for is already in there.
And still for Neil, can we do OCR on image and PDF while or before importing images to Tropy?
So Tropy we don't have the ability to do OCR within Tropy. You can certainly do OCR on your images or PDFs before they come into Tropy, but you need to keep in mind that Tropy is reading your photos as image files. So Tropy will not be reading the OCR if you have OCR'd that material already. And this is something that we know a lot of users are working with OCR. It's something that we're constantly in conversation about, to think about how best Tropy could interface with OCR. But it is important to keep that in mind. So if you have a PDF, you can certainly use your PDF in Tropy, but Tropy is reading it as an image file. So Tropy is not reading that OCR. So do keep that in mind in your process.
And from Carlos, he asked about differences between tags and lists.
What's the difference between a tag and a list? So yeah, I mean, I think that both of them are quite flexible. So people use them in different ways. The way I would describe the difference and how I conceptualize it in teaching and talking about Tropy is that lists are really more about structure. So lists allow you to sort of create a structure for your project, create different categories and kind of buckets to put materials in. So as I said, the chapter structure is the most obvious example. Tags, you could certainly have tags for chapters, but I think tags are a bit more flexible to work thematically. So thinking about sort of different themes and topics. And the nice thing is that tags can be overlapping. So you can create a tag for different themes, different historical actors, different processes, as I said. So, is this already transcribed? Is this already reviewed? Kind of notes to yourself as you go through the process. But I think it's a good question because there can be a lot of overlap between lists and tags. So some folks use lists quite a bit more, others only use tags and don't use lists. We create these options kind of for flexibility for you to find what works best for you. So I think that we have users who swear by a certain method for using tags, which is wonderful. But we really kind of try to keep this as flexible as possible. We're not prescribing one particular way to use it, and that's, I think, one of the principles behind the flexible software.
So we have also a question from Megan about the durability in the long term of the data that you collect in Tropy. But this is, I think, something linked with everything we do in the digital world, because she says it's okay for chapters, it's okay for a book, it's okay for a PhD. But then if after 30 years I want to access my data, and I invest such a lot of time in inputting data into a software like Tropy, will this be still available in the future? That's a philosophical question.
It's a great question. Yeah, I'm really glad that you raised that. We think a lot about sustainability at the center in general, and it's a conversation we talk a lot about in digital history and in the field. For Tropy in particular, I mean, it's something that this is one of the reasons why Tropy doesn't make copies of your photos, and Tropy is sort of linking out to your research photos. So we're really not in any way disrupting the stability of your materials and your image files. And again, encouraging you to make sure you're backing those up in whatever ways you back up materials. Obviously, none of us are able to predict what this landscape of software will look like in 30 years. But I think because Tropy allows you to work on those materials, but also keep them in their original form on a hard drive, it's allowing for sort of the stability of those materials over time. Of course, as you point out, you're doing a lot of work in Tropy, and so you don't want to lose that metadata. You don't want to lose those notes and those transcriptions. I can say that we're not going anywhere for as far as I know for a number of years, but I do think it's also, that's why the export mechanisms are also important. So exporting to a massive CSV could be a really durable and stable way to keep, if you want to keep that information in different forms. And we always recommend thinking about sustainability, making sure you're saving sort of different pathways to your information and building in redundancies. So if you're thinking, about those more philosophical questions long term, I think having the information in the CSV can be a great way to have another backup in another form.
And now some questions that were written after you ended, and I summarized writtenly the question from Igor from our institute. He asks, how do you introduce a date that is incomplete, just year and months, for example, or approximate?
Yeah, this is a great question. So the ISO format allows that flexibility. So let me see.
Yeah.
You can basically create, I don't know if it's, I'll just share again very quickly.
I think now if you want, if somebody who is still attending wants to ask something, you can easily raise your hand and speak loudly, and with your video, there's no problem.
I'll just, so hopefully you can see my screen here. This is a document I have not yet put a date on. So if I just put 1942 February, it'll just give me February 1942 here. So that's the nice thing about the ISO format, is that it does not need to be a complete exact date. You can put in just the year and the month, or the year, the month, and the day, and Tropy will read that in ISO format. So that's a great question. We very often will not have the complete metadata, and that's part of the process as well, and that's okay. And that also may, that may be an opportunity to create your own metadata template if you know, for example, for some materials, I'm not going to have box folder collection. You can always leave it blank, but you can also, reconfigure the template for your own needs. There was a second part of that question that I thought was really important to address, right? So I've gotten this question before, and I think it's really interesting. This comes up a lot. The question is, it is advisable to use the folder structure to replicate the structure of the archive? And I would, to that question, say an emphatic no. We don't recommend that. And it's not that it's a bad question. I think it's a great question. It's a question that comes up quite often, and I'm always eager to address it, because really what Tropy is offering you is the ability to create a different structure. So very often, if we're just using our file folders on our desktop, I think very often scholars will kind of try to replicate the structure of the archive in order to preserve the metadata information. So I know if this photo is in folder 11, within box 12, that's how I'm tracking the metadata. Well, once we start using Tropy, it frees us from that system. So Tropy allows us to track the metadata in different ways through all of these metadata templates. And that allows us to put documents in conversation in different ways and arrange them and organize them in different ways, which is really powerful. So back to the question about lists, for example, if I have a lot of different information that's about, for example, educational policy on Columbia, it may have come from 10 different archives, 10 different boxes and folders. Well, but maybe I want to bring that all together and put it next to each other. So I can actually get into a conversation between these documents. How do these documents talk to each other? How can I triangulate and corroborate them? Tropy allows me to do that in a list on education policy, for example, on chapter 1. So I think what's really powerful about Tropy is to remove the documents from that archival structure while still tracking the metadata. And so I think, just recreating that archival structure within Tropy it really won't serve you, and it really won't allow you to use Tropy to its full potential.
So other two questions, a simple one and a more complex one. Will you differentiate in your tags in addition to color people?
Yeah, I'm not sure.
That's the small one, but then he says something which I think interests everyone here. For an older researcher, so a person that already did a lot of research in archive, has a lot of pictures and photos, how do you recommend to migrate a big load of photos of years and years of research into Tropy? Just drag and drop.
Just drag and drop. Yeah, this is a great question. And as I said, I mean, I know we're all at different phases in our research, right? So of course, it'd be ideal to start this, on your first day as a doctoral student. That's not always possible. That wasn't possible for me. The Tropy came on later in my graduate school career. There is, I won't pretend there's not an upfront investment in getting into Tropy. And so there is going to be a process there. It's not going to be immediate for someone who's been working on their documents in another format. But I think, you know, it's a commitment, and it's worth it to kind of set up this system and say, I'm going to use this long-term, say for my next book project. I don't think you necessarily would have to go back and bring in all your materials from all your previous books. You could, but that would just be a, you know, an investment of time. The tag question, so as I showed you, you can change the tag color, and you can create a default tag color or sort of a random tag color. For people, it's really just up to you. So you create that structure. So you could certainly have all your tags be different people in your research, different historical actors, and you can assign a different color to each of them. But we don't have sort of a specific person tag. That would be a tag like any other.
Oh, another one from Claudia. If the link gets broken for many files in the same folder, do you have a kind of bulk option to fix all the links for each individual file? Or there is no, if I have to fix each individual file, or can I do it as a bulk option where you can do for all the files?
That's a great question. So it's the latter. You won't have to tell Tropy for each individual photo. Once you tell Tropy where one photo is, and this is what happened to me earlier as I was getting into this, once you tell Tropy where one photo is, it's able to find all the other photos in that folder. You can learn more about that in our documentation. You look for consolidation, photo consolidation. But that's really important, right? Because we basically want Tropy to be smart enough to, if you tell it where to find a photo, it can find the other image files as well. So you don't have to go one by one.
And from Emily, if photos are in the cloud, can there be a synchronization between Tropy's projects loaded on different computers?
Yes. So if the photos are in, for example, in Dropbox, if the photos are in Dropbox and the Tropy project is in Dropbox, you can open it on as many different computers as you want, and it will be synchronized. But as I said, you won't be able to work synchronously, meaning that if I have 3 individuals working on 3 different computers on the same Tropy project, they can't have it open and be working on it at the same time. But if it's you working on, say, your home computer and your work computer, you can certainly have it synchronized. Any work you do on your home computer will then show up on your work computer if you open the Tropy project from Dropbox or another cloud service.
Now, a connection between Omeka. Does the Omeka plugin synchronize data between Tropy and Omeka, or is it a one-time import?
As I understand it, the Omeka plugin is a one-time export. Sean may have more to add to that, but I think it's a one-time thing.
And then there is from Megan, can you return to Igor's question? When you, as a researcher, have to guess the date, can you add the question mark or indicate the question mark?
You can absolutely put in a question mark. I would encourage you, if you can, to stay in ISO format, meaning that, you know, if you're guessing that it's sometime in 1942, I would just put 1942, as opposed to inserting question marks that Tropy won't be able to read. But with all of these fields, I mean, we're encouraging you to use ISO format. You could certainly use a different format. It probably wouldn't be as useful or as powerful for you, but if there's a question mark and you'd like to add that in as part of your process, you could certainly do that, and Tropy will accept it. We're just encouraging you to use ISO when possible, because it'll make it easier for Tropy to read the date as a date. So that's why I showed you the example of if you know it's within the month of February, instead of putting a question mark on the date, I would just put February 1942, and that will allow you, and you can always come back later and fill in the date if you're able to identify it. And someone put in a note, I think that's a great idea in the chat. You can also add a tag that says date uncertain. If you want to sort of keep track of items where you don't know the date, that would be a great use for a tag.
Something which is more general, it's a question by Nele. Suppose we want to offer some training on Tropy at our university to researchers. Are they open materials, teaching materials that we can use? I know for Zotero is plenty of materials on the zotero.org. Is it the same in Tropy.org?
Great question. We are working on a lot of materials. We already have some materials on tropy.org. We're sort of in the earlier stages from where Zotero is. We're following in Zotero's footsteps. We're a bit younger, but I'm actually working on right now a very sort of quick getting started in Tropy 5-minute video that will be up on YouTube, hopefully within the next few weeks, and also be on our website. So for that, I'd really encourage you to sign up for the newsletter, follow us on Twitter. We've done a number of these webinars, and some of those videos are online, also on our YouTube channel, if you need kind of a refresher and some of the same stuff I went over. But one of my jobs actually going forward this year is to create sort of more targeted tutorial and training materials that will be available on tropy.org. So that includes webinars like this one, but it also includes sort of shorter videos. So about, you know, we know attention spans are also limited at this point. So, you know, a 5-minute video on how to create a metadata template, a 5-minute video on merging and editing items in Tropy, that sort of thing. So that's something that we're building up. That's part of our grant work. And yeah, that's an area that we'll be developing more and more as we go forward. I would encourage folks, as I said, to go to docs.tropy.org. There aren't a lot of videos or visual material there yet, but just it's pretty user-friendly and it's pretty easy to read. And we really lay out kind of the explanation for a lot of these features there.
So before closing and thanking you, we have still 5 minutes easily if you want. Please intervene. You can raise your hand and ask and raise the question directly also with your video. So we have a bit of interaction between us. Anyone want to ask a question? Just take the floor.
I see Nacheli asked something else in the chat, so I'm just gonna, regarding the last import. So Nacheli asks, how long will the imported items stay there if I don't assign them a home? Or will the import process force you to assign a home to those items? So great question. The last import page will always show the last import. So even if I did the last import last Tuesday, it will still be in last import until you do another import. So there's not a time limit there. But to your question about assigning them a home, I think that's a great question. You really don't need to assign the photos a home. So as I showed you, kind of the photos will always be there in the item table. So what we really encourage you to do is first and foremost, assign them metadata. And that will allow you to find them no matter where they are. So you may put them into a list, you may tag them, et cetera. But as long as you put the metadata on them, you're able to search and find them very quickly the next time you'd like to. So I think that's the most important thing. If you'd like, you could keep all your items in the item table. So you don't have to put them into lists if that's not useful to you. But I'm glad you raised that, Nacheli, because I think that's often a point of confusion.
There's just something that we passed through from Claudia. It was related to the former question, or maybe you can add a tag that says date uncertain. I don't know to what she was referring, but I think
yeah, I think that was to the question about, you know, if you're not sure of the date. And yeah, as I said, I think that's a great idea. You know, date uncertain tag could be really useful if that's something that you want to track.
Okay, so Jessica, I leave you to your morning and us to our evening. And thank you for participating. It was very useful. You have a lot of thanking messages. Yes, super useful. Thank you a lot. You were great. It was very clear. Thank you a lot. And I hope we can invite you the next time to Florence.
Great. Okay. Well, thank you so much. I hope so too. And I hope everyone stays in touch. If you have questions, feel free to get in touch with us on Twitter or on tropy.org.
Okay. So, bye-bye to everyone. Bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you very much.
Bye.